is simply an ongoing situation, which is a sort of Groundhog Day situation between Israel and Hamas, has been since Hamas seized the Gaza almost a decade ago, after Israel withdrew, which is that Hamas fires rockets into Israel. Israel responds by firing at launch sites, and now in its latest operation, and increasingly over the weekend, at the houses of Hamas leaders, whether they're in them or not. And so that it's simply ongoing. We've had several rounds of this before. It happens roughly every 18 months, 2 years. What's interesting about this one, incidentally, is that there's been less of the familiar replay in the international community than there's tended to.
What do you mean?
Well, last time, 2012, for instance, and the time before that, there was fairly large international outcry, United Nations, William Hague, and so on. This time, actually, that's been a lot more muted. I think that's possibly because the international community now realises what the status quo is in the region, and that the status quo is pretty unsustainable, albeit they're very keen to sustain it. That is a status quo in which Hamas launches rockets, Israel retaliates, and then everyone calls for a ceasefire. I think people are starting to realise that call for a ceasefire too early before achieving some operational objectives is actually part of the problem.
That's quite an interesting thing you raised there, Douglas. What are the operational objectives? I think lots of people aren't responding because they just don't understand quite what the aims are on both sides. I mean, Hamas want to show they're tougher than they actually are, probably. But what's Israel trying to demonstrate? What are the objectives here?
The simple objective is to try to stop rockets being fired into the body of Israel by militants. It started incidentally with Islamic Jihad, then Hamas joined in. Hamas had stopped firing rockets for a while. But Israel wants to stop the rockets being fired. I mean, stop its citizens living in air raid shelters and so on.
It seems to me, and it probably seems to sort of most people, that in fact you might create an environment in Gaza where people are furious with Israel and more likely to grow up to be to support Hamas and fire rockets themselves. I mean,
yes, it's possible, but that's a long-term.
But as you say, this
problem.
same conflict keeps happening every 2 years, and in part it's because both sides are creating the same conditions to produce angry young men.
The problem that Israel
who
has
fight each other next time.
Yeah, the problem that Israel has with the Gaza, the problem that everyone has with the Gaza, is it's very hard to see how you get Hamas out en masse.
Well, we ran an interesting piece,
problem.
didn't we, earlier this year about the fact that there are groups who are worse than Hamas.
Yes, there are ISIS-style groups now.
Although it's not entirely clear to me if Hamas is directly responsible for these rocket raids. I mean, it's one thing getting Hamas to agree. I mean, to say, right, stop this and make it okay, we will. But we can't stop it if other guys are firing, let's face it, pretty low-grade rockets. These are nothing like the artillery which Israel's got at its disposal. So it sounds bad, 8,000 rockets fired into Israel, but then I'm not quite sure how many have died as a result of those rockets. Well, we know 120 have died in the last few days.
Right.
Now that's a significant death toll, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, not in the history of conflict, but in terms of inequality of this conflict, of death ratio, of course. I just point out, I mean, Israel has a major problem on this, which is that it is too good at protecting its own citizens now. If Hamas, instead of building bunkers and then building mosques and schools on top of the bunkers and storing rockets under the mosques and schools, instead actually built bunkers which they allowed their citizens to go into, there would be fewer deaths in Gaza. Likewise, because Israel has had to build, and including in cities like Ashkelon, further north as well, shelters for the citizens of the country, and then additionally, this time round, has the Iron Dome, as it's called. Which is shooting down many of the incoming rockets. It means that the Israeli death toll is, at the moment it's nil in this conflict. Last time there were several people killed. But it means that Israel is almost too good now at protecting its own civilians, not, by the way, in the eyes of the civilians of Israel, of course, but in the eyes of the international community, who, as it were, if 100 Israelis had killed by now, many people in the international community would actually be very happy. They want 100 Israelis to be killed.
Sorry,
they want an equality of conflict. They think that there's an inequality of the conflict currently, and that somehow to have, as it were, a proportionate conflict, you need to have equal deaths on both sides.
Want is an unfair word.
Desire.
What country on earth would actually celebrate if there were 100 Israelis killed?
Well, quite a lot of the countries in the region would celebrate, of course. We know that much. Although, interesting enough, by the way, something that hasn't been picked up enough is that some of the Egyptian press is actually coming out against Gaza at the moment. Some. There have been a couple of columns in the last few days in Egyptian press. And one even saying, thank goodness for Benjamin Netanyahu, let us hope that there are more people like him that come along, because Hamas is our problem as well. But generally speaking, I mean, of course, in the region, there's not much love for Israel, and I'd argue in the international community there isn't much love for Israel. But to get back to this point about the inequality of the conflict, it is very striking. We haven't actually had much of the talk of the disproportionate thing this time. That has not been the norm since 2006. Although that could yet come back. One of the under-commented upon things in recent days has been the firing of rockets from the south of Lebanon. Israel obviously already has a problem on its Syrian border. In recent months, for the first time in some decades, it's been able to fire across the Syrian border in retaliation. So it's already got a very low level, but a level of conflict on the Syrian border. It's got the problem in the Gaza with Hamas. It's got the problem in the Sinai with Al-Qaeda-like elements. And then it's got the problems in the West Bank that are obviously ongoing. If it's also got the problems in the north with Lebanon, then it will be fighting a war on almost every front. The only thing to be said is that Israel currently is quite good at doing that. It's learned how to do it. It's done it before. It's done it most years since its birth. And it'll probably do it again.